Hello, my name is Jonathan Denny, and I was a student in Professor Iacobelli's Applied Research and Data Analysis class this past spring, and I would like to share my portion today of our class project, which involved food insecurity in Joe Davis County. So, a little bit of background on the project overall, as well as my portion specifically. Our class was tasked with identifying people struggling with food insecurity in Joe Davis County, which is a county in northwest Illinois. This project was brought to the attention of our professor by Eric Dregney from the Community Foundation of Joe Davis County. Now, we had a chance to meet with him via Zoom and discuss the project in depth, and he told us that the foundation had funding potentially available to help combat food insecurity, but they were not so sure about where to allocate those funds within the county. So that was our job to examine any data available, see if there were any patterns or correlations within that data, and help identify where potential funding could be allocated. Now, for our project, each of us chose to look at this problem from a different angle using different variables. So, throughout our class, we looked at numerous articles and studies about food insecurity, and I was able to come away with two important pieces of information. Firstly, a useful proxy for food insecurity is the poverty rate, and second, that churches are often used as distribution centers for food banks and food drives. It is for these reasons that I decided to compare the relationship between those two variables in each zip code within Joe Davis County to see if we could discover any patterns or correlations. Now, for my methodology, I chose to examine two main questions. Given that churches can and often do function as food distribution centers, are there any zip codes within Joe Davis County that can be identified as having a higher percentage of residents below the poverty level and having at least one church? And if not, can we identify churches within areas of higher poverty levels that could potentially be better utilized to lower food insecurity in those areas? So, as I stated earlier, the variables I was utilizing were the number of churches in each zip code within Joe Davis County, as well as the rate of poverty in each zip code. To find a list of churches located in Joe Davis County, I Google searched and was able to locate a database called hometownlocator.com, which was run specifically by the Illinois Gazetter. Now, this database had information listed for each church, including their zip codes. So I gathered that information into a spreadsheet and then used Google Maps to manually confirm the information that I had found within the database for all 15 zip codes within Joe Davis County. To find the rate of poverty in each zip code, I utilized the U.S. Census Bureau website, which contains a lot of information. Now, within the website, I was able to locate a table, specifically the S1701 table within the ACS 2020 estimates, that examined poverty status in the last 12 months over a variety of demographic breakdowns, such as age, sex, and employment status. For this project, I chose to focus on the overall estimated poverty rate for each zip code's total population. So I used this data point for all 15 zip codes within Joe Davis County. Now that we have our data, we can begin to examine it. I wanted to first see if there's any overlap between zip codes with churches and zip codes with lower poverty levels. This calls for a t-test, but in order to do so, I needed to separate the 15 zip codes into two different groups, those with a church and those without a church. After I had done so, I completed a t-test to find out if there were any statistical differences between zip codes with at least one church and zip codes without any churches. I also wanted to see how the distribution of churches in each zip code compared to the overall rate of poverty in that same zip code. To do this, I created a scatter plot comparing the number of churches on one axis with the overall percentage of poverty level on another. Here are the results of the scatter plot. As you can see, I added a vertical and horizontal dotted line to indicate the mean number of churches, 2.07, and poverty rate, 10.44%, across Joe Davis County. These lines divide the zip codes into four quadrants, separated by having relatively higher or lower poverty and a relatively higher or lower number of churches when compared to the rest of the county. It would appear that there is a general trend of the zip codes containing a fewer than average amount of churches having slightly higher than average poverty. Here we have our correlation matrix, which examines whether there is a correlation between zip codes having a church and a decrease in poverty rate. We can see that there is a correlation value of about negative 0.26 between zip codes that have a church and that zip code's rate of poverty, which is slightly greater than the negative zero point 0.3 threshold that would tell us of a statistically significant negative correlation. We can see this visually as well when comparing the slightly red tint of the matrix with the dark red control value indicating a perfect -1 correlation. When conducting a t-test between zip codes that have churches and zip codes that do not have churches, although there is a slight difference in the means, there is not a statistically significant difference in poverty rate between zip codes with a church and zip codes without a church. So what conclusions can we draw from this data? Although there appears to be a slight trend towards a negative correlation between poverty and churches, meaning the more churches you have, the less poverty, it is not statistically significant when we look at the correlation matrix and the t-test values. There are a few zip codes that have at least one church and a higher than average poverty rate. These are areas where resources could be provided to those churches in order to have a greater impact on food insecurity as a whole within the county. Finally, there are 4 zip codes with higher than average poverty and no churches within Joe Davis County. These zip codes should be targeted with a high priority and will require resources outside of church settings in order to make an impact. More discussion needs to be had about how to best suit these zip codes and what infrastructure exists that could potentially take the place of a church as a food distribution center. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to Professor Iacobelli for a great semester.